Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast exploring sex, relationships, and liberation. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have Ren. Join us for a conversation about our ever-evolving connection to the erotic. Together we talk about making out in confessional booths, learning to receive, and creating expansive connections. Hello, dear listener, and welcome back to Modern Anarchy. I am so delighted to have all of you pleasure activists from around the world tuning in for another episode each Wednesday. My name is Nicole. I am a sex and relationship psychotherapist with training in psychedelic integration therapy, and I am also the founder of the Pleasure Practice, supporting individuals in crafting expansive sex lives and intimate relationships. Dear listener, hello. Wow. You know, a few episodes back, I had mentioned how all of these episodes were recorded in a bulk recording before I went on my internship year, which I'm currently on, and I wanted to have enough content to be able to make it through a full year of an academic internship before I finish my doctorate. And so this episode is about 11 months old, and I will tell you, dear listener, after recording this episode, it really stuck with me. And the thing that stuck with me was this concept of bottoming, the receiving of pleasure. And Ren and I talk about what it means to just receive, right? And I have a Post-it note I'm looking at right now on my wall that says, I am not free until I can receive. Can I receive just pleasure without immediately feeling like I need to give back to the other person? Can I have a full orgasm, a full experience, and not feel this sense of obligation to give back? It's very similar to when you receive a compliment. We often immediately give one back to someone versus letting that sink in and actually receiving that. And wow, dear listener, a lot has changed for me in the last 11 months in terms of integrating that one. I feel pretty confident in my ability, and I hope you do too. And if not, what an invitation to start exploring what it means to receive pleasure from your partners without having to immediately give back. To remind yourself that the gift of being with you, the gift of seeing your body in pleasure is everything that you need there. And of course, you know, we want to give back to the people we love. We want to give back to the people that are bringing us pleasure. But this deeper question, I think, is important. Can you just receive? What comes up for you in terms of your ownership of pleasure, your right to pleasure when you think about just receiving? And I really hope that you enjoy today's episode exploring non-monogamy and pleasure and all the good things when it comes to sexual freedom. All right. Dear listener, if you are ready to liberate your pleasure, you can explore my offerings and resources at modernanarchypodcast.com, linked in the show notes below. And I want to say a big shout out to all of my Patreon members. You are supporting the long-term sustainability of the podcast, keeping this content free and accessible to all people. So thank you. If you want to join the Patreon community, get exclusive access into my research and personal exploration, then you can head on over to patreon.com/modernanarchypodcast, also linked in the show notes below. And with that, dear listener, please know that I am sending you all my love and let's tune in to today's episode. All right. So, the first question that I ask every guest is, how would you introduce yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, I like that question. I noticed that in the podcast that I've listened to, and I thought that was a good question. I think most people probably tend to label themselves off of their occupation, which like for me personally, I've never really resonated with the way that I make money. But I am on the journey of going back to school for psychology because I want to aim towards work, like becoming a therapist and working with queer people and trans people and people with religious trauma.
Mm,
But on top of that, I'll just say I'm sober, I'm 40 years old, I'm non-binary, poly, and queer. And just like my personal studies revolve around self-awareness, conflict resolution, parts work, polyamory, and finding authenticity, and really like finding my voice since coming out of the church.
yeah.
I've been mainly reading fiction books this year, like
Cool.
thought-provoking ones, which has been really exciting to sort of branch away from like self-help stuff, even though that's something that I'm always doing. And yeah, I've been off social media for 2 years. I have,
Congrats.
yeah, thanks. It's been amazing.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I love it. And yeah, I basically avoid stagnancy at all costs and am trying to find the balance between like being present and finding my next adventure, whether it's like physical or mental. And yeah, I have a primary nesting partner as well as a satellite, both of 2 years. And I've been living in Philly for 10 years and I'm about to move to upstate New York in a few.
Mhm.
Been a pretty big transitional time.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Well, thank you for coming onto the podcast, and I'm excited to talk, yeah, sex, relationships, and liberation with you today.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, I know in your guest form you had talked a little bit about polyamory, right? And relational dynamics, and had mentioned some interest in my dissertation research on relationship anarchy. I'm curious, is there anything about that where you'd want to start today?
Even though I haven't fully claimed relationship anarchy, it is something that I base, something I feel like I'm aiming more towards within my relationships in terms of like hierarchy and like couple privilege and stuff like that.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to unpack in terms of the narratives. I think specifically about you were talking about the Christian background, right? Those are very specific narratives of how to live a life. And so to come to that relationship anarchy, blank white canvas. Ooh, right? I'm curious, like, how are you living into those values? You said it's something that you're living towards. Like, what is that looking like for you?
Yeah, I think with just coming into the polyamorous world over the past 2.5 years, my journey kind of started maybe like 5 years ago when I started learning more about religious trauma. So like getting into somatic work and starting to like find my voice and like finding authenticity and realizing through multiple, I mean, really all a life full of monogamous relationships that I never was a cheater, but I never could maintain a relationship longer than like a year and a half. I guess the typical length of like NRE.
Right, right.
But I think that it's because I just didn't realize that polyamory was really like a option because like you
Mhm.
said, the religious world, especially like Christianity and in most religions, it's just not an option. It's not even something that you can think about. So I started working with a somatic coach, and that's when I was like, okay, yeah, like I'm polyamorous. And then that was when I was still just dating and I wasn't in a relationship yet. So from, starting to create that foundation for myself, when I got into a relationship, both of my partners like starting around the same time with two totally different dynamics and like structures, I was just, I don't know, I was very adamant about what it meant to me for it to like look a certain way and for it to not to be perceived a certain way, but for
Mm.
just like in terms of boundaries and in terms of what felt sustainable for me, or even reflecting on my tendencies in relationships over time with nesting partners or long-term partners, like what generally tends to happen and like how to kind of like, work through that or I don't know.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah, it reminds me a lot of my psychedelic work, right? How enlightening. How many ego deaths do you go through when you do this sort of like open relating and expansive relating? And I think, it's important in the same way that the psychedelic community doesn't seem to think that just having done psychedelics makes you more enlightened, because that's bullshit, right? Doing non-monogamy doesn't make you more enlightened, but damn, does it certainly highlight some shit, real fast. Where you're like, whoa, I didn't know I was making all of these unstated expectations. Whoa, I didn't know I was so insecure in my attachment over here. Whoa, I didn't know that, right? And so for me, it reminds me a lot of the psychedelic. You're really like dropped into they talk about it as a non-specific amplifier. And I feel like non-monogamy is a non-specific amplifier of attachment, right? Like you're like really feeling that, really navigating that in higher levels, in that sort of amplified state. So I think there's so much to unpack in there, and I'm still feeling it, like years into it, right? I can only imagine what I'll be unpacking in future years of it, but maybe this will resonate with you in terms of like what I'm able to unpack, sit with, be present with now. It reminds me a lot of rock climbing. Like that first time I looked up at the, wall, got to the top and was like shaking compared to like killing it these days, right? Like totally climbing some radical stuff that I could have never imagined. And so it does keep getting better, at least for me, in terms of what I can process and handle these days.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, it's 100% a process. I mean, it's like
Yeah,
speaking to attachment styles, like it's something that I've always been interested in, obviously more so after reading Polysecure
right.
and learning, just like about it in terms of non-monogamy. Like both of my partners, I sort of one, I lean more towards being avoidant, and one I can lean more towards being anxious. So it's almost like just interesting how,
Yes,
depending on the dynamic, it can go either.
right. Yes, exactly. That is something I've definitely talked about in my therapy work, is it's like it's not that simple of, oh, what attachment style do you have? It's like, I've seen all of them come out with different people, sometimes with the same person in different states, like one day I'm like, no, don't leave me clingy. The next day I get dysregulated and I'm so activated by it. I'm like, this is done. I don't even need this person. I'm out. I'm out. I'm out. Right. The avoidant, And it's like, I think it really just all comes out when you're in that amplified state of these various attachments. And so, yeah, there's still so much here to unpack in terms of attachment and all of that. And I think that part of it is really the narrative. We are narrative, existential, meaning making beings, right? And it's you see that around even like foods, right? Like foods that in certain cultures are normalized, and in some cultures we'd be like, oh, that's gross, how could you ever, right? Like these are very similar concepts, right? Of the things that we find like this sort of innate desire for being so culturally laden. There are cultures that practice non-monogamy as their cultural practice, and so the idea of monogamy would be unfathomable, right? And so I think sometimes it's really hard for us to take that sort of look internally and wonder how much of this is our own innate desire versus societal expectations. That's a lifelong journey there.
Oh yeah, I recently have or am currently reading Sex at Dawn,
Mm-hmm.
and so yeah,
Deep dive. Deep dive.
it is. I mean, it's like it can be a tough read in the beginning, like, going into all the differences of the different types of apes and all of that. But I think that it's cool to read the scientific evolution and evidence of non-monogamy because so many people just see the world from the past few generations that they've been alive or whatever, and just don't even think about the fact that before modern day civilization or even outside of America,
Right.
it's just not the case. But because it's the only thing that we see and the only thing that's been implemented for us, yeah, it's hard to get out of that like monogamous mindset, like even on a subconscious level, it's constantly affecting us.
Right. Yeah, totally. Right. And I think that's where I think back about like my internalized homophobia and my unknowingness of my queer identity. When I was in Christian culture, I would have smacked you if you told me I was queer. I would, how dare you? I am absolutely not. No. No, right? And so I think that when I look back on that, I was like, whoa, Nicole, you had no idea how deep those cultural narratives were impacting you. Whoa. Right. And I think that, yeah, Sex is Dawn, so fascinating. Like trying to pull it into our contemporary conversation. I talk about these different pieces as practices, right? Non-monogamy being a practice, monogamy being a practice, relationship anarchy practice. Because if I sit down, any human in a like laboratory context, right, and we have them watch porn, our bodies, our genitals respond. Your body responds to multiple people, not just one. You watch that movie, you see that hot TV star, your body responds to multiple people. Now, what you do with that is a practice. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so crazy to me. I guess, like, I want to respect the conversation around orientation, but really, when we look at it, we all have interest in multiple people. Some of us never want to explore that at the same time. Great. Some of us need that at the same time. Great. But at the core, like, we're all social beings with sexual attraction to multiple people. And I feel like I hope that part of conversation can at least be normalized for like even the monogamous relationships to like have that as be part of the discussion of like, it makes sense. We're attracted to beautiful humans in the world and we choose to invest our time and energy here. Great.
Right.
Great. Great. How much suffering is like literally just in that of like, you found that person attractive? You what? It's like, oh, beauty is beauty, my friends. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, also we're the only like, just like living thing that even analyzes that type of thought. You know what I mean? It's like my dog isn't thinking about like whose butt it sniffs, you know what I mean? Like it's not like, whoa, like that is like really too much into my personal space. Like let's have a boundaries conversation. Like
mm-hmm.
it's just like not even a thing that they think about. And like so it's just funny that like because we have the mental capacity to be able to like break shit down and like, talk about those types of things, we think that like, we have to just override our natural reactions to, like you said, like watching someone have sex or like whatever, or like being like, oh no, like I can't do that because that's not acceptable, or like my partner will get upset or like, you know, whatever. And I've been joking recently about how my Christian self, when I was like in high school, would, if they saw me now, would
I'd be
literally,
praying.
yeah, I'm like living the most sinful lifestyle that I could have ever imagined. And
It feels good.
it's great. Yeah, it's like it's wild, but being, held accountable for so many years to like not feed into my sinful nature or whatever is just a ridiculous thing to think about at this point.
Totally. I mean, it's years of social conditioning, of cutting ourselves off from our body, right? Because the body is sinful, the body is flesh. Do not listen. If you have any thoughts of anybody else, you've already committed adultery in the eyes of the Lord, right? So, like, you are totally scanning those thoughts constantly, trying to turn them off rather than being connected to your body and your eroticism and learning ways to move through the world with that, right? Again, not just unleashing that out onto the world, but to be able to, like, oh, I have these feelings. That's okay. And I'm going to choose what to do with them. It's so clamped down, it's so repressed. And this is 100% why we see the absolute horrific atrocities of non-consensual stuff within that community, right? That needs to be talked about. There's so much going on in that because it's so don't talk about it, don't talk about it, don't talk about it. And so part of my political agenda is to talk about the orgy that I went to, right? Because I think that the more we talk about this, the more we create spaces to have these conversations. So it's not so in the dark and so we can dream of what is possible. But you're right, coming from that paradigm, it's so many years of cutting that off despite the fact that like King David had 700 wives and 300 concubines, it was the chosen man of God, right? Like we forget that part, but that, I've
Of
been here
course.
a while. You can tell I got some points already to hit him with.
You'll probably be proud that I recently made out in a confessional booth.
Ooh, that's powerful. That's powerful. Do you want to talk about what that means? Let's integrate that psychedelic experience right here.
Yeah.
hmm
Yeah, I mean, it's just like things that I was constantly creating like resistance around or like had accepted as like the thorn in my side or whatever. I am able to like embrace and like part of that, around my work with religious trauma was actually connecting with queer Christians. I don't like to like feel victimized to it. I don't like to blame like my experience with the church or like my rejection or unacceptance like by the Christians that I knew. But like to find the queer people that are like, yeah, like basically to just differentiate Christians
Sure.
from, my idea of what God is not necessarily rooted in Christianity anymore. But I would still say I'm like a spiritual person. So yeah, I mean, having an experience of making out in a confession booth, it's like just kind of ironic because being in a Catholic church is so rooted in like tradition and like dogma and all of that. And there's no like sense of liveliness, in terms of God even being there. Is God there? I mean, I have no idea. So it's kind of like this interesting metaphor of being able to laugh at myself or whatever.
Yeah, it sounds very empowering, like a really like moment to take that space and something that has that had that history and past and to have ownership over it through your divine pleasure in there.
Yeah.
Very powerful. I'm here for that. So hell yeah. Yeah, so many kink scenes I've experienced are running through my head right now in terms of playing with this stuff, right? It's true. The Catholics have the kinkiest of sex. We have, so much power, like differentials going on. I even think about in the past, I've thought about the world of like, God's constantly watching you. Like that's taught from such a young age, which is like just again the beginnings of an exhibitionist fantasy, right? Like, oh, someone's constantly watched. Oh, so like,
Yeah.
yeah,
God, the number one voyeur.
totally. Which in the time you're like, oh no, he's watching, like Santa, Jesus. But like, oh no, but then like that creates a constant world in your head where you're thinking about who is watching me. And so, yeah, when you start to play with the empowerment of it, that's still deep within there, And so there's a lot to play with. I like to talk about like, yeah, the ways that these experiences can really create so much like play and moments for empowerment for us as we like move forward into our narratives with it.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of like fetishes and like stuff like that is interesting because it's like there's ways that I've fetishized religious trauma that does feel empowering, and then there's also been ways that have sort of been unhealthy for
Sure.
me, like around, like being a secret because, for so long I had to keep my queerness a secret. So like when I started going to therapy, I realized that I was only dating unavailable people or dating people that were like non-consensually cheating on their partners with me. I was fetishizing it in a way that wasn't actually healthy or beneficial for me. And I didn't realize that I was doing it until I could associate it with religious trauma.
hmm
Or there's been situations where I've blamed religious trauma or I've used religious trauma to, in terms of my sexual preferences, like, okay, maybe I'm not into this because I have repressed this aspect of my sexuality, or no, maybe it's not actually religious trauma. Maybe it's just body dysmorphia and I don't actually prefer doing that because it doesn't give me euphoria in my body, so it's
hmm
can be a really hard thing to differentiate sometimes.
Totally. How many times can you spin that Rubik's Cube around, right? Like, what is this? Where is this coming from, right? And it's probably some yes and to all of it. But yeah, I just think about like, the man who is only interested in dominating femmes and women. And that's the only way that they get off is kink DS dynamics,
Right.
right? When do we actually ask the questions of like, yes, we're pro kink, yes, we're pro exploring and having the space to explore these things. But also, if that's the only way you're getting off, when do we need to look at that and say patriarchy has probably affected you, my friend, right? And kind of have that deeper, nuanced conversation about that. And so I get angry when that attack then becomes on all of kink, because when I'm playing with a DS dynamic with my two femme lovers, like, is that not even more empowering? But then there's that subsequent deeper question of like, is that not just the larger patriarchal colonial structures influencing into your psyche? Maybe, or maybe power is fun to play with and letting go and submitting. And I mean, again, these are questions you could just simmer in for literally a lifetime. And I don't think we'll know, kind of like you're saying, through therapy of unpacking that, like, yeah, what does a utopian world look like where there is no longer shame, where we can talk about our pleasure, where we could safely talk about the BDSM dungeon that you went to, and in those states, what does turn us on? I don't know, right? Right now, with all of the shame that is in our culture, there is so much of shame that is fun and erotic to play with because it's what we've been conditioned around. Ooh, this is bad, naughty, don't talk about it. So then, of course, we like to play with the bad and the naughty, right? So, oh, yeah, I have deep questions about what the future of our eroticism looks like when we're in a much more shameless society about it.
Right.
Unknowns, unknowns.
Yeah, man. I am looking forward to that day.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like gender roles and even like
Sure.
societal norms around, yeah, like who takes the dom role or who takes the sub role or whatever is like something I've been processing a lot recently, like since I started taking testosterone, because I, can still get boxed into the idea of what like being a mask presenting person means or like what it should mean. And also like now that I'm taking hormones, like what I feel like my body is desiring like in different ways. So
Sure.
it's like I feel like something that if you're open to it can constantly be evolving. But yeah, so many people are stuck in like the stereotype of like what patriarchy tells you that you're supposed to do, or you're like weak.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Absolutely. I'm curious what's been like helpful for you as you're kind of navigating that unpacking process. What has been helpful?
Yeah. I read Stone Butch Blues, which if you haven't read that, is a great one. But that's kind of where I found the language around being stone and being a service top. So
Mm,
like I started learning more about I've never been too into labels, but the more I find language around it, the more I
sure.
kind of love it because it's
Yeah.
almost like, okay, this makes sense. Like this resonates with me. Oh, like they're talking about me. Like that's exactly what I am. Like I find pleasure in giving pleasure. I don't need to receive it. So it's like being in so many monogamous relationships, it's just assumed that you're switch and that like, if I wasn't allowing someone to please me, then they were like missing out on something that they wanted. You know what I mean? So in non-monogamy, it's like you don't have to do that. Like you can just say like, okay, in this dynamic, this is how I am. In this dynamic, this is how I am. There's no assumptions or whatever. No one has to like miss out on anything. So until I like accepted that and claimed that idea like within non-monogamy, it wasn't until I was able to more so process what it was that I preferred. Like, so it's complicated.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is the constant change, right? Change, change. Just when you think it's there, it like whoop, whoop, whoop keeps moving, right? As like, which makes sense as like our narratives unfold, right? Like you just talked to me about it. That maybe changes just even the slightest little bit of like where you're at before this conversation. And then you'll have another conversation and then another. And then like years pass by and we've added up all of that stuff. And so, of course, we're not like existentially at the same point anymore, right? So, which is scary because it's like, where are we going? But also how beautiful, right? To know that it's this constant process of connection to our authenticity, connection to our pleasure, connection to language that better communicates with people where we're at. And at least in my own journey, I definitely resonate with what you were saying about these different relationships and being able to explore different aspects of erotic connection with people really expansively in ways that, you don't have to feel like it's this full, like being a service top, right? Versus in the more like one-on-one dynamics, feeling like you said, like that feeling like you're missing out on something. Wow, I've struggled with that. I've really struggled with just being like a bottom, right? Like, see, I even put the word in there, just a bottom. Just a
Yeah.
bottom. Because the second I receive, I'm like, oh, I need to give back. I need to, and that has been absolutely fascinating to explore in these different dynamics of like, what is that automatic tendency that comes up? Where did that come from? How deep is that in my psyche? And then when I do pin back to being taught as a Christian, like, okay, Nicole, my mom, love her. She's like, one day you're going to be giving your body to your husband. Giving, right? Giving. So I'm service or I'm bottoming at the dungeon, and then all of a sudden I feel the need to give, and it's like, okay, right? So like so much to unpack that. You're right. Like the more that we get into these various dynamics, like we were talking about the attachment that comes up, the sex dynamics that come up when you're with other people. Oh my God, right? Intense.
It's funny that you say that your mom talks about giving your body to your husband because I think that actually the idea like for Christians is that like when you're giving your body, when a like an AFAB person is giving their body to an AMAB person, that AMAB person is literally just using their body as a whole. It's like I feel like most women like in the Christian world aren't giving anything. They're just laying there and they're not receiving pleasure, I'm sure. Like, I
Right.
mean, especially if they, feel like sex is only for procreation.
Right.
You're basically allowing yourself to receive without actually getting anything. In terms of like bottoming, like, and learning more about like being like a power bottom, for example, or being like a bratty bottom,
Sure.
for lack of better words, being the one like calling the shots as a bottom while receiving, especially if it's a heterosexual relationship or even a queer relationship, like penis and vagina, like dynamic, like the exchange can be so much different when I don't know, like for me, it's like if I have my strap on and I'm giving, then I'm not actually feeling anything, or I'm not actually like there isn't the possibility that I'm going to have an orgasm and lose my boner. You know what I mean? Like it's like so the dynamic can just like continue to play based off of like a fetish or an idea or like a desire or whatever. So yeah, the whole idea of giving yourself to your husband is just like mind blowing to me, I guess.
Me too.
Yeah. But
Instead of co-creating with your husband, right? Like it's like truly like talk about BDSM, right? Like you're an object for your husband to take, right? Which is fun when you do it consensually, right? But not when it's a forced paradigm upon you of like you're gonna give your body again as if it's an object to give to
right.
them, right? So like that's where it was like a non-consensual dynamic because I didn't get a choice of any other paradigm, right? That's what I was taught and that's where it started, right? And yeah, there is no discussion of your pleasure. There is no discussion of you can, be the bottom that says this is how you want it to look. All of that sort of stuff just wasn't talked about. And it's a part of what creates like the grooming conditions of purity culture. And it's something I've talked about. It was a great episode with Dr. Rachel Smith that kind of went into that. And she's done a lot of purity culture recovery groups and seeing like repeated patterns of how that sort of teaching really like creates conditions for violence and other sorts of things because you're not taught
Mhm.
bodily autonomy, let alone pleasure. And hence why, at least for me personally, it has been such a radical experience to have these queer experiences, and to have these expansive non-monogamous experiences, and to have these experiences in the dungeon where like I've quite literally learned to communicate my pleasure with multiple people and feel safe with that in ways that was never taught to me.
Hmm. Yeah, so now it's like the idea of like just bottoming is like a very like powerful place to be because like for me, like I think because of my religious trauma, I have a hard time receiving because
Mm,
it's like a more like I think about this like being a service top, like I wonder and like I question if I like to give in that way because it feels like less like sinful or something
mm,
than to receive, to just like receive pleasure physically. And like it's something that I need to like I think still work through in order to be able to receive physically. Or if, I just like don't prefer to receive physically in that way. But like, being a power bottom, there's also, the idea that someone who is a service top wants to be with someone that isn't going to try and give
I
back. Like
know.
I can't have a sexual relationship with someone that wants to give back. Like it just doesn't work. So like accepting the role or preference of being a bottom is a powerful realization to like fully embrace for the people that are looking for that. So it's like, yeah, you don't need to put the word just in front.
I know. I'm like literally trying to listen to that and integrate that into my body. I'm thinking about like literally the experience I had had with one of my lovers and them like, yeah, offering to top and me immediately just feeling like, oh, I gotta give back. I gotta give back. Right. And I think that like it is quite literally hard to hear that and to integrate that of like, no, like they've had the beautiful experience of servicing my body, and that is the gift. There is no, that further expectation. And so to actually feel that, I talk about like the idea of like I'm not free until I can receive, right? And like, what does it mean for me to actually receive and not feel that obligation? And until then, I don't know if I'm like really free and liberated just because it's so deeply ingrained in me. And so it is something that, like, yeah, when you're speaking about it, I'm thinking, like, yes, okay, how do I integrate that so I don't have this like automatic knee jerk reaction? Um, and I feel like the first time I really noticed that too was like when I had a sexological body work experience where like I had paid someone, you know. And so like there and money is its own power dynamic, right? So but I paid someone and during that experience felt this such need to like give back to them, like, oh, I need to hug them or service them back. And I was like, what the fuck? Like that's fascinating. Where is that coming from, right? Like I literally paid this person. I do not need to do that. And it was like my first insight many years ago into this sort of like automatic expectation of service. So I think that definitely tracks to something I'm still unpacking.
Yeah. Yeah, because it also though is a service to me when you or any bottom, just receives. That's the service. Like you are giving back. So that's the thing. Like that's the ironic part about it is like that's exactly what a service top wants. Like that's all that they want. So like in that regard, like you are giving back.
I know. Which is beautiful. And I'm so happy that we're having this conversation on a public platform because, like, where do you have that conversation for someone to learn that? That's not modeled, and unless you're in the community and the culture, and then you start to have conversations like this, and you're like, oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. But how many people have never even heard of that concept and then would absolutely go through the same patterns that I've struggled with in terms of feeling like I'm not doing enough?
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just like, can lead into just another aspect of capitalistic America. But like, no one ever thinks that they're doing enough in any regard.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So then you add something complicated like eroticism on top and it's like the whole thing blows up. Totally. Yeah. And so I think that it's some of the beauty of being able to explore these different parts of ourselves erotically, We've always talked about in psychology how your sense of self is formed by all your different relationships. And so, as someone coming into the space, I guess it's not shocking, but like here to talk about the fact that your sense of sexuality is also developed in multiple relationships as well. And I've definitely also talked about, again, like even when people are practicing monogamy, your sense of sexuality is still shaped by multiple relationships. I think we just don't think about that, right? Like when you're watching the porn, your perspective of what you're seeing is behind the camera lens of a director. That's someone who's telling you a story, right? Or someone who sat next to you and said, I want to tell you an erotic story. That's like forming your sense of self, right? The romantic novels that people read, right? Like that's someone who wrote that, another human forming your sense of erotic self. I hope people can get a bigger, expansive idea to understanding that, like, just like our concept of self is shaped through multiple relationships, your eroticism is too, again, right? Like whether you practice with one or multiple, it's all of this going on in your milieu, in your narratives. All of that is there. And then the choice of, the reality is that time and energy are limited.
Hmm. Yeah.
You have to sit with that, and not everyone wants to invest in the multiple, and I get that, man. Like I get that, so like at the end of the day, everyone's going to make those choices about how they want to, invest. And I've gotten to such a space of like saturation. Like I have so many different people, it's like saturated. And now like figuring out like, wow, I have lots of different lovers, and then how do you kind of like balance the orbits out of all of those people? Oof, fascinating. Fascinating.
Seriously. Yeah, I mean, I've been like thinking a lot about the idea of like novelty though.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, with having like a primary partnership, what I've kind of realized around, where I don't totally fit into relationship anarchy. I mean, I guess if you think about relationship anarchy on a spectrum, just like anything else, as like a non-traditional like form of relationship, I like to have a primary partnership that is like more like rooted in not necessarily a platonic, like a fully platonic relationship, but I think because of my desire for novelty, it's just like not possible to have like a long-term sexual dynamic with a primary partner. So, just even coming to terms with that idea within, the parameters of what feeling saturated means. It's like, okay, I can I have the capacity for, maybe in a monogamous relationship, maybe you would be having just as much sex with like one person as you are with right now multiple people. So it's like, you can have the capacity for multiple people in the ways that maybe most people have with one person. But it's just a matter of like switching the perspective on like what the actual capacity is. Obviously, there's different personalities and like needs and desires that come into play, that maybe you have to like juggle. But I think, with non-monogamy and relationship anarchy, it's like you can still decide what you have the capacity for when it comes to boundaries and when it comes to like people, the level that you want to satisfy someone's needs or desires, like in a micro or macro like level. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much space, again, that blank canvas to like really create outside. We're no longer coloring the lines. So yeah, if you have a prioritized primary partner where it's like you said, like not primarily platonic, but like in that sort of space and having novelty out, like that's a whole different world, right? Like a whole blank canvas that you get to create. And so I love the expansiveness of that. And I think back to some of the research I had found. And again, this research is so incredibly limited. So, like, there's nothing, I mean, we can make conclusions from it, but also we can't, because it's like one study and that's not how you make good conclusions about life. But I've seen studies that say that, I've seen some studies that say polyamorous relationships have definitely better relationship satisfaction than monogamous couples, just facts. But in terms of sexuality being very close, and then I've seen studies that say swingers actually have the highest sexual satisfaction. But in terms of relational satisfaction, lower, below monogamy, below poly. Now, how I look at this data and I think about it is like, okay, cool. So you could be polyamorous. Say you've got two partners, right? Those two partners you spend the rest of your life with, you still hit the same level of potential quote unquote boredom, stagnancy, etc. in a world where swingers are like constantly moving through novelty and exploration. But maybe under the paradigm of swinging, the common conception is that like those people don't have really great relational skills, ability to talk about the emotions when they do come up, right? And that sort of world. And so I think that might maybe explain the relational satisfactions going lower but below monogamy and stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, but we really don't know. I think it makes sense that humans have this desire for novelty. Like when I'm working with monogamous clients, I always try to talk about the worlds of like, your partner's changing, you're changing, you're at a different point, right? And the novelty of that. But hey, for me, that's not enough. For me personally, I want multiple people, and right. So I think just getting into those frames, it's important that we're constantly changing no matter where we're at. And for me, I try to like let go of this question, like when I was first coming into my queer identity of like, am I actually a lesbian that's been so fucked up by the patriarchy and I don't like men at all or anyone who comes from a masculine body? Or actually, can I just follow my pleasure as it unfolds, right? There might be years of my life where I have sex with lots of people, years of my life where I have sex with nobody at all, and just like allowing that unfolding rather than trying to fit into these boxes of these specific things, I think has been really expansive for me.
Well, yeah, because the queer world and especially like the lesbian world can be like just as gatekeepy as anyone else. It's like when I identified as a lesbian and I was, a gold star,
That's what I was going to say.
so much pride in that. And then there was just this one night where I was at a concert and this guy like comes up to me and like starts talking to me. And I'm like, oh, like for some reason I'm attracted to this
Yeah,
person. And like I felt very intrigued by oh, I'm just gonna like have sex with this guy. Like, why not? I'm like, I don't want to put myself in a box and like not follow this desire. Like, just because I identify as a lesbian, or like, you're not supposed to desire a man because you're a lesbian. You know what I mean?
right.
Like, so I think like breaking out of that mindset is important, and like why I feel like the queer world is like just overall, just more like accepting of whatever, it's just like, okay, whatever the day brings, like just see what happens. That's kind of just how it is for us, luckily. And I'm very like grateful for that opportunity where, I'm reading this book on the daughters of Bilitis, which is like the rise of the lesbian movement.
Ah, cool.
And like, in the 50s, it's like, okay, you had to wear 3 items of clothing that matched your gender assigned at birth, or you would get arrested for transvestism. So it's like, you know, there was a lot of like understandable gatekeeping that happened, where now it's like we have the opportunity for it to be like flexible, and we don't have to say like, oh yeah, just because I identify as a lesbian and I have sex with a man doesn't mean that I lose my title as a lesbian or whatever,
Mm, absolutely. Yeah. When we're like fighting for such liberation, right? There's a lot of vitriol and like hard, like aggressive ways where like, no, this is community, protect the community, right? And yeah, as we're moving into more liberation, more expansiveness to like not have to be so dogmatic, right? Reminds me a lot of my professor Dr. Berkey and I have talked about like kink and the fight to get kink out of the DSM as a pathology, right? Of like it's not a pathology, it's not a pathology with consenting adults. And then in that space also missing the reality that like yes, it is not a pathology. Is there chaotic relationships to kink and BDSM? Yes, right? Drugs, similar thing. Drugs are bad, psychedelics bad, 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 bad. We fight so hard to get out of that. And people can still have a chaotic use to psilocybin, chaotic use to ketamine. Like these are real things, right? And so I think that, yeah, when we're trying to get out of these models, it's so much fighting. Like this is the way, this is who you are. And if you're not here, get out, right? And as we're getting more liberation, I think we're creating more space for expansive ways of being and like a more nuanced understanding to these topics.
Right. Yeah, it's funny how like, coming out of the church and having all the rules, we end up creating more rules to follow, like without even realizing it.
Totally. And then it makes me think about the relationship anarchists that practice monogamy, right?
Mhm.
Some people might really get into what, how could, what, you know? And I do like the idea of like getting outside of this paradigm of like the monogamy or non-monogamy and viewing our world through that of like, oh, okay, like you could practice relationship anarchy and sexual fidelity. Like I have sex with one person or this closed throuple or this, closed polycule, right? And that being a practice. But I think a lot of people would get kind of vitriolic about that and say, "How dare you have sex with one person? You're repressed. You're this. You're that." Right? And it's like, I don't know. There's a lot of people that go through this. They live it out. They have all the people, and then say, "I don't know. I like my one. This is nice." And I think that in our communities, we have to be conscious of not like presuming those people have stuff they haven't unpacked, especially when they've walked it, lived it, and chose that consciously. So I think that's a similar vein of people like turning up their nose at that stuff. And I definitely did that at the beginning too, because I felt like, no, like you're not a part of the movement, and like wanting everyone there, but that's just not going to be everyone's path. And I think we got to get past that. I'm speaking to myself and my past versions. Yeah.
So what does your relationship world look like?
Yeah. I would say that I talk about it in orbiting systems. So I have a beautiful community of different relationships that I see at different orbits and frequencies. I have multiple people that I explore sexual connections with and eroticism with, and those orbit at different frequencies. I would say right now I have like two people that are orbiting on a deeply weekly basis of that, and then someone that's orbiting at like a 2 week, and then another person that's maybe like more monthly. She's a little flighty. She likes to travel a lot, and so I see her when she's in town. So I do that, but I also have a lot of platonic connections that orbit and are just as meaningful and deep understandings of myself. And so I try to like really allow each relationship to unfold for what it is, but of course, have really in this development like hit the limitations of time and energy, and like I've got a wedding coming up and there's a +1, right? And you damn, what do you do and those sorts of things, and just the complexities of you can have all these beautiful relationships in a very kitchen table dynamic. We all rock climb on Sunday, right? But the realities of when you're co-creating space or co-sharing space, the group psychology dynamics are different than one-on-one time, right? And
Right.
so if when you hit the limitation of your time and energy, sure, you can get all your partners together for the kitchen table, but when are you doing the one-on-one? And for me, that
Mhm.
feels meaningful to create space for the one-on-one too. But yeah, you just really hit that time and energy limitation real fast.
Right, right. So like within like that, you feel like you like would you say you're more like solo or you just like don't have a hierarchy or like,
Yeah, I would say I'm a relationship anarchist, and I would say that I practice, because yeah, hierarchy is such a complex word. People are so against it. And so then what I'm hearing in the community is this word of like prioritization. And I think
Right.
that's where I like the ideas of the orbits, right? Like when I have an orbiting partner, I would say maybe the closest orbiting partner. This is someone I talk to every day. I see, every other day. Like the reality is that person's orbiting me at a much closer rate. So, yeah, if they call and need me, they're orbiting at a much closer rate than the friend that I see once a month. And that's a reality, in my opinion, of any form of attachment. And so, sure, we don't have to use the word hierarchy. How close does that get? Fun conversation there, right? Just in terms of like the realities of your limited time and energy. But I feel like that's kind of where the community is going in terms of like, this is a prioritized partner. Um, yeah.
So you still use the word partner. Like you
Yeah.
have like with some people like you have like a like the whole like DTR like
Totally.
conversation where you claim the word partners
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, I do. I think it's fun. I think that it's political when I say, oh, this is one of my partners. I have multiple. I find that to be political rather than just friend. Not that friend can't be important. Again, it's like We all get the power to choose these words and what they mean to us. One of my partners likes to call me their girlfriend, right? And I call them my boyfriend, which is a word that I really hadn't used in a long time, but it means something to them. And I'm happy to be in that world with them. And for me, yeah, the words partner, I can have platonic partners, right? I think for me that word means something to me personally, and it's going to mean something to them, and you too, dear listener who's tuning in, right? And I think we should have the autonomy to create the language that feels authentic to us. And so if someone doesn't want to use partner and use friend, that's beautiful. For me, it feels intentional to have these words that signal something different than my coworkers, than my community members in my climbing space that are my friends, that I don't orbit as closely, you know? So for me, I like having the language to kind of indicate where these people are at in terms of their presence in my life.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think like, with how I feel intrigued about relationship anarchy, it's like cool to hear things like that because it's like I kind of had this idea in my head that like you wouldn't even say someone was your partner, not you, but just like someone that's like a
Sure.
relationship anarchist, like, I don't, take responsibility for anyone. Like I don't, have like commitments. And like I think that's where I guess has where I've felt hesitancy around the idea of relationship anarchy, where, having a conversation like this, brings me closer to the idea of relationship anarchy because it's like I still being polyamorous, like love the idea of like depth and love and
Right.
connection and like responsibility and commitment and like, that can look however you want it to.
Right.
I my satellite partner is someone that I also see like once a month and right
Right.
now is living in Paris for a year. And so like, it's like we come in and out of each other's lives, but there's still like a consistency to it
Mm-hmm.
that feels important and like something that I feel like dedicated to. But, we didn't necessarily even talk about the title of being partners like until more recently, where my primary partnership, we had much more communication around like the intentionality of
Yeah.
wanted our partnership to look like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like hearing your universe.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it, and I'm happy that it like creates more space for the concepts because I think that I was about to say I'm no expert, and that's true. I did a dissertation on it. I'm still exploring it. I'm just a human in it, but like I don't know. Expert's a weird word. Anyhow, if I know anything about relationship anarchy, it's about dismantling power dynamics and the way that that has been so deeply infiltrated into our practice of relationship. It's about examining the relationship escalator. There's nothing wrong with taking it. The
Right.
question is, have you examined it and considered the other ways of relating? And so for me, I think it's this practice of use the language that feels authentic to you, create the worlds that feel authentic to you, and be conscious of the power dynamics and how they're constantly in our lives. And for me, that's why I call it a practice. There is no endpoint to relationship anarchy, right? Where I like totally free of patriarchy, totally free of racism, totally free of all of the isms, right, that impact the ways I show up in my community. Because really, relationship anarchy is about community, not even who I'm dating, right? It's like, am I showing up for my community truly? So I hope that I can be a part of like changing the narratives of this, like, no partner, no commitments, no depth, because it seems like that's really actually very off of
Right.
the realities of our lived experience.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the power dynamic aspect is important, I think, and that's something that I definitely like strive towards breaking up like within my partnerships and like it can be I feel like more difficult in a primary partnership because the idea of couple privilege, like me and my primary have been working around like the idea of consent in small ways, like because we live together, like, just not assuming that I'm like available to have a conversation right now, or like
Sure.
assuming that we're gonna have dinner together tonight, so we have found little ways, like by having like a shared calendar where like, okay, like it looks like you're not doing anything tonight. Hey, are you available to hang out tonight? And just like building that into the relationship instead of just like expecting that because we live together, because we're primaries, that I'm not doing anything else. And like with the power dynamic, we're not prioritizing like our relationship over our friendships or like platonic relationships or secondary relationships or whatever. Yeah, I think that I through conversations like this, am realizing more of how I am experiencing relationship anarchy, like in
Mm.
small ways like that.
Yeah, that's definitely what I was thinking about just in terms of like self-governance, right? And like, yeah, checking in with intention and not presuming ownership over your partner, right? That's so powerful. And I immediately was making me think about eroticism and the ways that, like Esther Perel had talked about how desire is wanting, right? And so when you make the assumption that my partner is already there, they're already going to be there for that dinner. I already have them. There is no space for the desire, the longing, the wanting. And so when you can come back to that, like, oh, my partner is a separate person, I can definitely check in with them, right? And then that creating the intentionality and the desire for them through that sort of spacing. And yeah, definitely in terms of what you were talking about of like prioritizing our platonic connections, because again, that comes back to the concepts of community, like relationship anarchy being absolutely not about who you fuck, right? It's about this like larger community structure and how am I holding all of that? So then hence the values of like the platonic connections and all of that and like holding that as a way to like dismantle the larger systems, right? The larger systems that have put us into nuclear families that have broken us up and like bringing us back into that, that's all there. And that's something that people can practice in solo poly, in monogamy, in polyamory. Like those value systems, I think are very possible in all those different orientations when it's done with intentionality.
Right, for sure. Yeah, Esther Perel. Gotta love.
Mm.
Are you talking about Mating in Captivity?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, awesome book. Yeah, I
Mhm.
we just actually did a course with her called Turning Conflict into Connection,
Ooh.
which was really powerful.
It's
Um,
probably not about BDSM and fun conflict, right? Unfortunately, she doesn't seem to hit on that.
it could be. But yeah, her and Dan Savage also just like did this like joint talk that we listened to as well, which
Cool.
was but but yeah, I think like yeah, relationship anarchy. It's definitely like something that I'm excited to continue learning about, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Well, it's been such a joy to unpack all of this with you and to learn more about your life and for you to hold space for mine. So I really appreciate that. And I want to take a moment for both of us to take a deep breath together. And then I want to check in and see if there's anything else that you want to share with the listeners. Otherwise, I can guide us towards a closing question.
Mm. Yeah, I just want to say like the idea of checking in, just continue checking in with yourself every day about who you are and what you want, and let it lead you down the path. And like, really, you never know what's going to happen. Like, just stay open and allow for space and stay curious. I think that's the most important. Stay curious.
Mhm. Absolutely. I love that. So, so important. Mhm. Well, if it feels good to you, I'll guide us towards our closing question.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So, the one question that I ask everyone on the podcast is what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
More normal. Hmm.
Yep.
The idea of expressing your wants and desires. Like even as simple as that, like most people don't find that as normal. Like I'll go on dates and they're like, "Oh, no one's ever asked me that before." I'm like, "What?" I
Scary.
don't understand. Like just like being able to think about it, like normalizing, like thinking about what you want for your life, or like thinking about what you want over what someone else wants.
Yep. And then feeling into that. That's the fun one too. I love to like, okay, I have this idea, and then how does it feel in my body? Do I feel that tightness? Do I feel an openness? Like, what is that bringing up for me when I think about that future and trying to connect to the wisdom of my body that lives in this present moment? When oftentimes my head goes to the past or the future, the body is like right here materially. Complex
Mhm.
though when we're holding trauma and how that impacts that. I'm not, you know, I'm definitely hold that as a therapist and how that impacts our ability, right? Because sometimes you talk about stuff and it makes you anxious because it's fast stuff. But for the most part, when we're here, like being able to actually like check in, like, oh, how does this feel in my body when I think about that future?
Mhm.
That's a powerful practice.
Yeah, for sure. But also, like, not trying to aim for like a constant sense of like future
Yeah.
security,
Yep.
but yeah, staying present, differentiating between, yeah, trauma responses is definitely important and like tough work. But yeah, normalizing a world without social media.
Yeah, totally. You got off the drug we're all still suffering with. Well, it's been such a joy. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast and being so vulnerable with all of us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Is there anywhere you want to plug in terms of having the listeners connect with you and your work?
Feel free to reach out at DAURIALA @yahoo.com.
Great. Thank you for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And head on over to modernanarchypodcast.com to get resources and learn more about all the things we talked about on today's episode. I want to thank you for tuning in, and I will see you all next week.